Now that's an obscure passage, but it's prophet Jeremiah's justification for the exile. And the exile is the period where the Israelites were forced from their land and made to live as captives in Babylon for decades. So this is the explanation for such a consequence. And so as the story goes, King Zedekiah made a covenant with all the people of Jerusalem to free the humans they enslaved. Everyone agreed and let them go, and then they broke their promise and took back all the men and women they had freed to enslave them again. So as a result, according to the prophet Jeremiah, God was mighty unpleased. If you won't free these people, then I'll free you. You'll be free to die by the sword, disease, and famine. And I decided not to read the next 10 verses because I didn't want to burden you with the descriptions of unpleasantness. Yeah, God was mighty unpleased. If you won't free these people, then I'll free you to die from the sword, disease, and famine. So the people re-enslaved those who were to go free, who were actually set free. And Jeremiah's response to them was, "What's wrong with you people?" And reminded them that God had freed their ancestors, that God had brought them out of the land of Egypt, that God had led them out of the house of slavery. Now, this obscure passage references one of many commands God gave to Moses during the period of their 40 years in the wilderness, including every 7th year, each of you must free any Hebrews who have been sold to you, and after they have served you for 6 years, you must set them free. An obscure passage based on an equally obscure reference to the book of Leviticus. Now, I know you've all read the book of Leviticus, you know it very well, and it may recur to you, oh, that's where that was in chapter 25. Yeah, chapter 25 contains a number of very oddly specific commands, including verses like 3 and 4. You will plant your fields for 6 years, and prune your vineyards and gather their crops for 6 years, but in the 7th year, the land will have a special Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You must not plant your fields or prune your vineyards. And there are many more just like this. And you have to ask, well, why? Why all of these very oddly specific commands? So you think about the 40-year period that we know of in the wilderness. They wandered. We think of them as freedom training. They're escaped slaves. How does someone who has been held in slavery adjust to freedom? Right? So once you have been property, how do you own property? So you have to create a new identity for yourself, one that doesn't involve, I belong to somebody. And that was the job of Moses to teach, this freedom training. And according to the great biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, that freedom training, Moses sought to give the Hebrew people a distinct identity. Now, it's not an identity based on their territory or their ethnicity or their language, but it's an identity defined by their ethics. And at the heart of it, back in Leviticus 25, something called Jubilee. The Jubilee year. Here's how that begins. Listen, count off 7 weeks of years, that is 7 times 7, so that the 7 weeks of years totals 49 years. I have no idea how they arrived at that, but at the end of 49 years, then have the trumpet blown on the 10th day of the 7th month, and you will make the 50th year holy, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It will be a year of jubilee for you. Each of you must return to your family property and to your extended family, because the 50th year will be a jubilee year for you. and then Leviticus 25. I know you're going to go look them up because they're, you like to read a contract? It's the same sort of thing. It's a very specific directives. For example, do not plant, do not harvest the secondary growth, and do not gather from the freely growing vines because it is a Jubilee. It will be holy to you. Each of you must return to your family property in this year of Jubilee. But here's the big one. If one of your fellow Israelites faces financial difficulty with you and sells themselves to you, you must not make him work as a slave. Instead, they will be like a hired laborer or a foreign guest to you. They will work for you until the Jubilee year, at which point the poor Israelite, along with their children, will be released from you. They can return to their extended family and to their family property. You must do this because these people are my servants. I brought them out of Egypt's land. They must not be sold as slaves. You will not harshly rule over them, but must fear your God. So these are specific instructions. These are not generalities. It's because Moses wanted his people to be unlike their neighboring nations. They were not to be known because of their great wealth. He wanted them to be distinct as a people who had once been someone else's property, to have a different ethical relationship with property. And so what is that? To have a lifestyle that's not based on accumulation or of always trying to acquire more. Because at the end of 49 years, it's going to revert to the original owners. And so there's no purpose for greed or monopoly for them. They're not supposed to be a community based on haves or have-nots, because whatever inequality had grown over the course of 49 years, it was to be returned in the 50th Jubilee. It's a novel idea. And where did it come from? Well, Moses watched the extreme inequality of their neighboring Canaanites and declared, we are going to live differently. And he named and he declared it Jubilee. Now, as Walter Brueggemann describes it, he said, this isn't just about having good intentions or kind thoughts or a religious idea. These were concrete, material, economic acts to be undertaken with discipline and intentionality. And then he adds, it's the most difficult, most demanding, and most outrageous requirement of biblical faith. And wow, if we were to live it, that certainly would be. As many note that there's no evidence that there ever was an actual Jubilee year. You know how people like to say that we got to take the Bible literally? It's never been applied to this text. But it does set a vision. It sets an expectation for God's people. Again, from Brueggemann, God's vision is not of accumulation so that those with the most at the end win, but a vision of peaceableness, of neighborliness, when, quote, the vicious cycles of violent accumulation are broken. Got to read that one again. That just blew my mind. I read it. It's like, wow. When the vicious cycles of accumulation are broken. That's powerful. Things like when no human is ever owned by another human, or when no human is ever so indebted they can never be free. That's Jubilee freedom. And that's Juneteenth. A celebration of people finally set free. This once obscure observance, now turned national holiday, is finally getting the attention it deserves. And we should take every opportunity to acknowledge there was a time when some people owned other human beings in our country, that they live among us as the ancestors still to this day, as the descendants, that we need to tell truth and understand consequences and then repair and continue to ensure that freedom remains forever in all its forms, and to celebrate that God is a God of freedom for the enslaved, that God is a God of liberty for the captives, and God is a God of Jubilee for the indebted. This is central in our biblical faith, and it's central to the followers of Jesus, who declared his mission of heaven on earth in chapter 4 of Luke, the Gospel. In fact, I want to read you the Gospel passage, and so is our custom, we'll have to stand for the reading of the Gospel. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been raised, and on the Sabbath he went to the synagogue, as he normally did, and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah, and he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me and sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the assistant, and sat down. And every eye on the synagogue was fixed on him, and he began to explain to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled, just as you heard it." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So this year of the Lord's favor, it's an enactment of Jubilee. Release from captivity, enslaved humans freed, debts canceled, families returned to their land, and the land itself is given a break. Now, let me say briefly that biblical slavery and the kind of chattel slavery practiced in the Americas are not the same thing. Those enslaved in the Bible may have been a conquered people, but not because of a hierarchy based on an entire race enslaved because they're deemed inferior. And someone might have found themselves enslaved because of debt, or even sold themselves to pay a debt. But it's not the kind of economic exploitation that fueled an entire nation's expansion of extreme wealth on the backs of one race, without any hope of release. In fact, whose children and grandchildren were born enslaved too. Different things. But back to Juneteenth. So we're becoming more familiar with the broad strokes of the story. 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, word had not yet reached Texans who were enslaved. Under order of General Gordon Granger, number 3, announced their emancipation and, quote, absolute equality. But you know, it wasn't just his word. He was flanked by 2 transports full of black soldiers. Those who had been enslaved saw evidence of their freedom in all the uniforms of those soldiers. An entire corps composed of free and formerly enslaved black men. Imagine what a sight it would have been to see that. But there's a detail that you might not have known, and I find this just fascinating. So Granger and his soldiers had not been sent to Galveston to spread the news, as I had imagined. You know what they were doing? They were en route to secure the Mexican border against the invading army of Napoleon. You go, what? Yeah, the French were establishing colonies in Mexico. So the southern border had to be secured from the French. Yeah, laugh. Isn't that just blew my mind. I love history. So it was while they were on their way for that assignment that a storm hit. And the storm was bad enough to cause their ships to seek shelter, and the storm forced the transport ships to anchor in Galveston Bay on June 18th, 1865. It was the day after the storm that they went ashore and discovered thousands of enslaved people working in the ports and houses and fields. And so order number 3 was written. Now, what if there had been no storm? I mean, when would word have finally reached the enslaved of their emancipation, their freedom? You know how sometimes storms are called acts of God? And I've never liked that. Stop blaming God. But at least in this case, I'm glad for such an act of God storm. Well, so back to Jesus and reading from the scroll and the proclamation of the year of the Lord's favor. If we were to continue after that in Isaiah, it continues to give them garlands and ashes in place of ashes, oil of joy in place of mourning, a mantle of praise in place of discouragement. They will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will restore formerly deserted places. They will renew their ruined cities and places deserted in generations past. And so on this Juneteenth, let's commit to building a land where we bind up the broken, to build a land where anyone captive can go free, a promised land where everyone is truly free, to be who God created each of us to be. Amen. And I invite you to sing along the song